football in the 916 Sactown Sports.
With Kyle Draper and Whitey Gleason. 49er fans had an easy weekend, right? Because they had the game Thursday, an easy win, but now they're facing Kyle Draper. An Arizona team that is on fire. A classic trap game scenario for even you admit that, right? For the 49ers. Classic trap game
Yeah,
scenario.
the big game is coming up in a week against Dallas. This is a red-hot Cardinals team coming into town here.
Yeah. How dangerous is this game for the Niners? Let's find out from our 49er insider from the Candlestick Chronicles, Chris Biderman. How are you today, Chris?
I'm doing outstanding. How are you guys?
Good.
What's
Thanks
up,
for
Chris?
joining us. We appreciate it. Dangerous trap game scenario for the 49ers, or is that kind of ludicrous?
No, I think it's fair. Human nature in a long NFL season often comes through, and we've seen the 49ers as good as they've been the last few years succumb to some of those human nature moments. But I think I've said it here and a few different places that like this team does feel like it has a different sense of urgency because of the importance they're putting on getting off to a hot start to the season, and they know that the Dallas game would have even a little bit less meaning if they ended up losing it, right? Like they want to go into that Dallas game with a full game up on them in the standings at least, and in doing so they have to beat Arizona on Sunday. So it's a division opponent. I don't think the 49ers are going to take them lightly, but yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if there was an element of human nature coming through a little bit early in the game on Sunday.
Chris, when you look at what the Niners have accomplished so far, they look good, obviously undefeated. I maintain, the strength of schedule so far. The teams they've played are a little worse than I expected out the gate. How much stock do we put into this 3-0 start? I know they're a great team. I know they'll be good, but should we temper just a little bit, hanging the banner a sixth Super Bowl just yet until we see a little bit more? Because some people in this studio, they're already crowning them division champs in a runaway.
Yeah, Seattle's definitely one of those teams that might be a little bit better than we thought, or particularly after week one. But no, I mean, look, I think 49ers fans, for the most part, are well aware that a quick start doesn't mean anything, right? Like ultimately in 2019, they started out 9-0 in that year, and they went to the Super Bowl, but they lost to the Chiefs. And Niners fans know, even going into the playoffs last year on the winning streak that the team was on, it didn't mean anything when it came to the game in Philadelphia, right? So it ultimately, for this fan base and this organization, it's about winning the Super Bowl. Like this team has been together long enough. This core is at a point where you might see some guys fall off in terms of payroll and all of that. Like this core might not be together going forward beyond this season. So they understand that the expectations are super high, and it's not necessarily about winning games in September. It's about winning games in January and particularly early February, right? So I think for the most part, the Niners are where they expect themselves to be. They do have one of the best offenses in the league. They absolutely have one of the best defenses in the league, and that's borne out through the first 3 games of the season. But I'm with you. Like, it's far too early to crown them. But if you're looking at where they stand versus the rest of the league, I think they're right at the top, which is where they belong. But ultimately, that means very little in the grand scheme of things if they don't win a Super Bowl.
He's Chris Biderman from the Candlestick Chronicles. Chris, with the Dolphins just shattering all kinds of scoring records, they've got Mike McDaniel there, of course. Can you tell us, in terms that aren't too involved, how similar are the 49ers and the Dolphins in terms of what they're trying to do offensively?
Yeah, they're pretty similar. I would say the biggest difference is probably the physicality that the Niners play with versus the speed that the Dolphins play with. Like, you see Deebo Samuel and Tyreek Hill run some of those same jet motions where they're sprinting really towards the sideline at the snap, and that's designed to sort of space out the defense and force defenders to make difficult decisions and coverages and things like that. But where the Niners are different is, they don't have as much speed. Not to say they don't have speed on offense, but Miami just has completely different level speed. Like, we might have never seen anybody as fast as Tyreek Hill in terms of the way he accelerates and in terms of the way he changes the geometry of defenses. And, the Niners have really good players, but they don't have a player with that type of skill set. So there are different ways to skin a cat. Of course, there are different ways to get yards after the catch with which both teams really specialize in. With the Niners, it's about physicality. It's about breaking tackles. With the Dolphins, it's more about running away from teams and changing the geometry of the field with the speed that they have. So they're similar in what they're trying to accomplish. They just go about it in different ways.
We were talking just a few minutes ago about the face of this Niners team. From a player standpoint, who would you say is the face of the franchise? Who's that guy for this team?
Does it have to be a player?
Yeah, that's what we were talking about. Exactly. We thought it was Kyle Shanahan, but if you had to choose a player, I don't know who it would be.
Yeah, I think just in terms of outspoken personality, it's probably George Kittle, right? He's the guy who you see on TV the most in terms of commercial appeal, who might have the most social media appeal, in terms of, the big personality. In terms of on the field stuff, I mean, you could make the case for Christian McCaffrey, given the fact that they haven't lost a regular season game since they've gotten him, and he's setting all sorts of records and scoring touchdowns seemingly every week. He's somebody who's really emerging potentially as an offensive player of the year candidate early on. You could make a case for Nick Bosa, given that he's the reigning defensive player of the year who just signed the biggest contract for a defender in NFL history. So it sort of depends on how you define the face of the franchise thing, because I don't think it's Brock Purdy yet. I think if the Niners win a Super Bowl and Brock Purdy plays well in a playoff run, then I think he probably ascends to that stature, because there's no competing with the quarterback when it comes to that discussion. But ultimately right now, I'd probably say it's Kittle, but to me, this is Kyle Shanahan's operation, right? It just feels like Kyle Shanahan is the guy you think about most when you think about the 49ers, which is saying a lot, but it's also speaking to the fact that they haven't really had a star quarterback who carries the load as much as maybe a Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen does for their respective teams. So I would say Kittle, but to me, when I think face of the franchise, it's probably Kyle Shanahan when you're just zooming out and looking at the big picture.
He's Chris Biderman from the Candlestick Chronicles. Which 49ers right now, Chris, would you say are playing well? That is among guys who aren't the big stars, who aren't getting as much recognition. So other than, the big names on the Niners, who are some guys that are really, would you say, kind of under the radar playing well for them right now?
What's interesting is it seems like Javon Kinlaw is having a bounce back season, and the first round pick from 2020, somebody who's been embattled a little bit, dealt with knee injuries. He had a knee injury coming out, and it just hasn't gotten right. And finally this year, it comes after the 49ers have made a big splashy free agent addition in Javon Hargrave. But Javon Kinlaw has quietly been pretty good in his reserve role. And that might be the best way to utilize him right now, given that you don't have to tax him physically as much as you would have previously when he was a starter. You could kind of ease him in and rotate him into that defensive tackle group. And you're sort of maximizing him that way if you don't have to rely on him to play 80% of the snaps like you would some of the other guys along that front. So I think he's having a really nice year. I think Travarius Ward is generally pretty good. Diamador Lenore, like, you could go up and down the defense. It's hard to find somebody who's really struggling. I thought Isaiah Oliver was really good in week 2 against the Rams. Jawan Jennings is making a handful of good catches each week, it seems like. And, when we talk about the 49ers skill guys, it's always Deebo Samuel and Christian McCaffrey and Brandon Ayuk and George Kittle. Jawan Jennings has been pretty good so far and is making a lot of, tougher catches that, the balls are being thrown to him before he makes his breaks, and he has to turn around, locate the ball. And sometimes it's behind them a little bit. Sometimes, it's in traffic. So I would say those guys in terms of like under the radar players, which sort of speaks to 49ers have so much star power that it's almost difficult to think about the under the radar guys. But those are the guys I would mention. Jawan Jennings in particular, probably.
Chris, before the season began, during training camp and preseason, there seemed like so much drama surrounding this team, whether it's Trey Lance, Moody's inefficiencies, the Bosa situation. But once the game started, they've seemed to just, push all that aside. Who do you give credit for that? Is that Shanahan keeping that locker room, some of the veterans on the team? How have they been able to, forget about all those distractions in the preseason and focus during the regular season?
I think it's a product mostly of Kyle Shanahan and sort of the culture that they've built there. And a lot of that has to do with continuity, right? Like you've had a infrastructure and group of players, a lot of whom have been around since 2017. And at that point, you have guys that are comfortable in the system, you have guys that are comfortable in the environment. And ultimately in the NFL, I think a really underrated thing is just continuity. And so what the 49ers have is they have a really good team, obviously. They have continuity and they have a culture that allows them to absorb some of those more awkward situations in a way that, a lot of the 49ers stuff it's like it's happening on Twitter. It's happening on talk radio. It's happening on podcasts. It's not necessarily happening at the same level inside the locker room. And I think that speaks to the maturity of a lot of the guys they have, because to a man, you ask those players and they'll tell you a lot of this stuff, whether it's quarterback drama, or, I think Nick Bosa's absence was a little bit different because there was some legitimate fear there that, like, man, we might be without our best player on defense for a little bit of time here. I think that was actually tangible, but I think for the most part, when it comes to the drama that we tend to associate with the 49ers, they tend to do a pretty good job of disassociating themselves with it and focusing on the task at hand. I know that's cliche and, all of those things. Take it one day at a time and only focus on the things you can control and all that. But I do think there's an element of just like maturity and continuity that allows them to deal with that stuff and not focus on it maybe in the same way that like we would on Twitter or, again, podcast, sports radio, all of those things. It's just they seem to isolate themselves through it. And I think that or from it. And I think that's a strength that they have as a team.
Chris, we appreciate it. We may have set a record here. I think that's the first conversation we've had without mentioning Jake Moody, which is interesting. He's so rock solid now. What does that say? But are we going to see you at King's Media Day on Monday?
Yes, I will be there.
All right. We'll see you then. Thank you. We appreciate it very much. Chris Biderman, Candlestick Chronicles. If you're a 49er fan, you got to be checking out the Chronicles. Coming up next, the new load management rules. Do they give the Kings an advantage